Welcome to the C Word, the Conservators podcast. Today we're talking about hazards. I'm Jenny Mathiasson, an objects conservator based in South Yorkshire.
I'm Chloe Rumsey, an objects conservator based in Greater Manchester.
And I'm Christina Rizek, an objects conservator based in Cambridgeshire.
Right, ladies, today's topic is danger, danger. And also, this is the first episode of Season 2.
Welcome to Season 2.
Oh, yay. Did you miss us? We weren't gone for that long. So Season 2. Yeah, brilliant.
We've got a lot of really good episodes lined up for this season.
Yes, we're quite keen, actually. We're kind of itching to do some of them. We're like, why are we recording that now?
Well, it's because we're recording this one and it's just as good.
Yes, it is. It's also brilliant. We hope you enjoy it. Today's topic is danger, danger. Hazards, basically. Ladies, actually, first, we will do some news, I just remembered. Does anyone have any news?
I have news. If you're a member of ICON, you may have seen an email that came out recently saying that there are still places at the Health and Safety for Conservators courses, which ties in very nicely with today's episode.
Oh, indeed.
So they are running in Edinburgh on the 11th of October, in Birmingham on the 20th of October, and in London on the 21st of October. They're run by Martin Adlam, who's a health and safety consultant, and they'll basically give you loads of really useful health and safety information for conservators who are working in a conservation studio or on site. So I hope that there may still be places by the time this goes out. I don't know. We're recording this on the 6th of August, but just a heads up about those courses coming up.
Yes, absolutely. And Christine and I both have experience of kind of working with Martin. So I'd really recommend any of his courses. He's good. Yeah, that's a brilliant piece of news. Another piece of news is that the next ICON conference, which will be in 2019, has been announced to be in Belfast this time. So it's Northern Ireland next time. So we don't have dates yet or anything like that or confirmed venues, but we do have a geographical location, and that is pretty good.
Do we have a topic?
I don't think so. I didn't notice anything. So I think it's just that it's going to be Northern Ireland this time, which is fine. So start saving up if you're not in Northern Ireland, basically. And another thing that happened over summer was that the 40th anniversary issue, the special issue of the Journal of the Institute of Conservation, came out. And it's entitled The Future of Conservation.
It's a very grand title, I thought.
It is very grand. It is worth a read, though. It's interesting stuff. Anyone else? No? In that case, let's power on. Hazards. Or who's going to have a first stab at this one?
So I feel like in the sort of research and reading that I did for this and thinking about it, I saw two types of hazards that we face. And I think originally I was thinking, well, it's hazards in collections, because that's the experience that I've had before working with a science collection. And that's sort of, I think of it very much in those terms. But I think that other hosts have spoken to people that have a much more, vocational idea of the hazards that we face. So there's hazards in collections, and then there's the hazards we face doing the things that we do, chemical hazards and health and safety at work. So I suppose what have we encountered before?
God, yeah. Okay, so that's an interesting one. I guess if we're talking hazards in collections, I feel like I've worked in the vicinity of radioactive things, but I haven't necessarily dealt with it very much. I don't feel very confident in dealing with it as a topic, and I would really love to get a Geiger counter. That is one of my dream things. I'd love a Geiger counter.
They're not expensive, actually.
Yeah, but the thing is, I don't know what kind to get. There's no actual... I don't feel like there's all that much out there in terms of recommendations or even any kind of guidelines. It's just kind of, do you want to get a Geiger counter? Well, good luck.
I know someone who has done a lot of research into how to manage her own collection, the radioactive objects in her own collection, and she found out loads and loads of stuff about it, but it involved putting together information from lots of different places. There wasn't anything out there, and she was considering writing up something.
Oh God, I hope she does.
Kind of specifically aimed at conservators, which might well cover things like what kind of Geiger counter should you get, and how should you store these things? What are your statutory responsibilities when you're looking after these objects? What are your reporting responsibilities? That kind of thing. So yeah, if next time I see her, I will say that she has to do this.
Yes, please do, because that would be really interesting.
No, I was going to say, I think one of the things she also sort of felt was that there were quite a lot of people she spoke to who didn't have a big sort of significant number of radioactive objects in their collections. They maybe only had one or two, maybe sort of a watch with fluorescent radium paint on the dial, or that kind of thing, or a kind of random mineral sample that was radioactive, that kind of thing. And it was really kind of very much a one-off object. So what do you do when you don't actually have very many things?
Yeah.
Well, so what I was going to say is, in one of my old museums, we only had a few objects, and a neighbouring museum only had a few objects. So we actually came to an arrangement to store them on the same site, and they kind of pooled their storage and their responsibility for it. And that meant that two quite small museums were able to manage this in a much more efficient way.
Oh, that's
so. That's nice. Always an option with hazards.
Yeah,
yeah. I think that is a really nice one for small museums, particularly because, well, when you're in your close proximity to each other, because otherwise it is a bit of a, God, what do we do if something has to be isolated? I'm interested that this is the first hazard that we're talking about, because of the hazards that I've worked with, I feel like this is the one that I am sort of least concerned with and least I've seen least of, and I think that's probably because the science collection I worked with, the person who was already there had already done all of the work involving isolating radioactive objects, and in that case they were just sent off-site, I believe. That's the same kind of thing, collaborating with other sites for a sort of big master storage. Though, does that have implications to the strength of the radioactive source then, if you're increasing?
Yeah, because if you put more things in one place, it adds up.
Yeah, and you're only allowed so much radioactivity, if you like, but they decided that they had an allowance. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but they had an allowance that was kind of in common between the two museums, I think. So they kind of, shared it between themselves. I don't know quite who sort of sets these limits, but
I guess why this came up in my mind first is that it's because it's something that I know that loads of people aren't really aware even that they could have anything radioactive. So it's something that I vaguely think about. And then I think, how do I solve that problem? How do I check? And the answer there tends to be, well, you either get someone in to do it or you get a Geiger counter. And for me, it seems much more appropriate to get a Geiger counter, except that's where I kind of hit a kind of wall with what do I get. But something that really intrigued me was that they now do little Geiger counter things to plug into your smartphone and stuff like that.
What? That's amazing.
Yes, but the thing is, I don't know how accurate they are, and I kind of want someone to go away and test all these, because they're about 30 quid each, which is sometimes cheaper than a Geiger counter. I mean, it is, but...
Well, it's cheap as an option for testing your radioactivity, and expensive as a waste of money if it doesn't work.
yeah, exactly. So I kind of wanted someone to go away and do like a little kind of survey of how accurate these things are.
So there we go. There's a project idea for anyone wanting to do something on radioactivity.
Yeah, any PhD students.
Free idea.
There you go. Have a go. So anyway, that's why that cropped up first. But obviously there are much more common hazards. I
suppose that's a good example, because it brings up the concept of knowledge and expertise in hazards in general. So obviously we've picked the first topic of hazards in collections, and I think quite a lot of conservators don't set out thinking, I will approach hazards in my work. It's more something that you kind of slowly learn about over time. First, I imagine, you start thinking, oh yes, so pesticides in collections, and then you work in a various historical museums and think, okay, radioactivity, and then asbestos. Oh, look, there's some mercury. oh, okay, so there's this type of oil that can kill you. Okay. And then it kind of increases and increases. And if the knowledge and education support doesn't increase at the same time, you're just going to be terrified because there's all sorts of things out there.
Yeah. So that's an interesting one. How do you communicate risk without also freaking everyone out? Because that is...
Oh, Chloe!
Yeah.
Now. So I did my dissertation on the communication of hazards in collections, particularly thinking about pesticides, because I did my internship in an ethnographic museum, and pesticides it's one of the things you sort of grow to I was going to say grow to love, but you certainly don't do that. You grow to know that there will be pesticides on your collections. You know, if it looks undamaged, it's probably poisonous. So I was looking at the different types of communication method, and also how people perceive risk on a sort of psychological level. And that was really interesting because basically it has a lot to do with the sort of preconceived ideas of what does carcinogenic mean and what does toxic mean. And I think that has been relevant in how I've talked to others about risks and hazards in collections. So in recently this week, I delivered some training, and the training that I was actually doing was I was communicating that this is why we wear gloves. And I used the words arsenic as an example of one of the residues that could be on objects. And of course that it was a particular age group of people, and that had a very sort of sensational effect on how they understood that as a hazard. And because it was training, I was able to sort of talk them down in a way of saying, well, don't worry, it's absolutely fine because there's such small quantities. So in a conversational way, I could provide them with more information. But had I just sort of presented them with a label or a hazard label of contains arsenic or something, that is something that would be sort of a detrimental level of a perception of risk, if you see what I mean. You'd get people actually being frightened.
Yeah, I think, yeah. So I think the problem I have is that people tend to be freaked out if you tell them there is any kind of hazard associated with an object. Well, either that or they don't believe you. It kind of goes both ways. I was like, no, I can't see anything on this object, so clearly it has nothing on it, for example.
Yeah, I found that a lot with asbestos, that people... If you either have people who go, oh, asbestos, fine, or you have people that really sort of essentially freak out. Oh, what do you mean this object has asbestos in it? Yeah, but don't worry, it's not. It's enclosed. It's fine. It's perfectly safe. What do you mean it has asbestos in it? And I think, oh, if you don't disturb it, it's fine. You know, it's one of these. You know, we have a lot of words and a small amount of knowledge about hazards, but that can actually just be more scary than having all of the information. I think that's what I've learned working in a science collection. It's, yes, there are loads of scary things. Like the first time that I had to deal with mercury, for example, I was terrified. But actually, as soon as I saw the way that mercury behaved, and I had it in an enclosed environment and it was perfectly safe, and I had all the kit and the gloves and everything, it's actually, you know, quite, as hazards go, it's quite safe. You know, it behaves in a certain way. You can predict it. There are ways to clean it up and everything. So now I've had that experience, I'm not so frightened. But before I was, you know, oh, I'm going to need some help, please. I'm frightened and I don't understand. So I think generally providing yourself with as much information about a certain thing is going to comfort you. And if you have to look after your collection as equal, you can't just, you've got to deal with it essentially. As long as you feel safe, then you know, the best way to deal with it is to arm yourself with information and PPE.
You say you've got to deal with it, but actually there's a limit to what you can reasonably be expected to deal with. And I think that's a really important point to make to conservators as well, is that yes, you're responsible for looking after your collection, but it's also unfair of your employer to expect you to do anything that seriously puts your health and well-being at risk. And yes, you can use PPE and you can take mitigating measures and so on, but there is also a point where you should be able to say, actually, no, I really don't feel comfortable doing this.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it's easy to say, oh yeah, just as long as you know, it's fine. But part of the knowledge is knowing the outside sources of information and support that there are. So for asbestos, you've got CADEC and other asbestos survey people that do work a lot with museums, and they mitigate asbestos as in that they contain it, they clean it up, or they identify it and say, no, this is hazardous, there is nothing you can do about it. And I have heard before some institutions, some museums, wanting their conservators to train in the mitigation of asbestos, and I'm not happy with that, because essentially pay levels, we're not paid enough to shorten our lives, and it's not sort of what we signed up for. But if you work in a asbestos mitigation company, then that's, you have the training, you have the income, as it were, you have the pay, and it's sort of what you signed up for. In terms of other things like mercury, I suppose it is absolutely everyone should feel that they can, and they should be able to say, I'm not happy with dealing with this. And there have been instances where I've said, I'm a bit frightened of this, actually. But I'm not sure what the approach would be then if you've got to clean up the hazard, or you've got to separate the hazard. Other than asbestos, I don't know the support networks that there are.
I guess I've worked in 2 different science museums, or museums with scientific collections, and one of them in particular had a lot of objects relating to the history of science. So those actually presented more hazards than you might get in more modern objects. But there were things like, one of the things I was most scared of dealing with was a very, very fragile, thin glass bulb full of chlorine gas.
What?
And they essentially said to us, okay, clean this thing, but if you drop it, run. And in retrospect, I'm really, really, really unhappy with that as a health and safety strategy.
That's terrifying.
I was going to say the other thing that came to mind is that then there's a kind of difference between these sorts of acute risks, like loose mercury or chlorine gas in your lab or whatever, and the sort of more insidious long-term risks that you face, which we tend to kind of write off. So, just kind of cumulative use of chemicals and solvents for cleaning and that sort of thing, where the risk in itself is quite low, but the cumulative risk might actually pose a health hazard. And I think that's something we're really bad at understanding as a profession.
Yeah, and that has has a really strong impact actually on people's perception of risks psychologically. If it's a sort of long drawn out, uncertain, kind of far away in the future type risk, it's seen as sort of, it's scary because it's unknown, but it's also, that's going to happen to, the version of me in the future, or, it's probably not going to happen to me kind of thing. I'm interested in how the fact that we know different risks that we know affect how we feel about them, because I'm particularly frightened of the idea of biological hazards because I've not really ever had to deal with them. So, you say, oh, how confident am I in cleaning this and not breaking it? Well, I don't think we can ever be 100% confident in not breaking something, can we? Because, that's conservators interact with objects. That's the point. We're the people who, if we're going to handle something with and attempt to essentially test how it operates, can we remove this from this rack? We're the people that will be breaking something.
Yeah, it's a classic risk assessment then, though, isn't it? Where you're weighing up the likelihood of an adverse event and then the severity of the event if it does actually happen. And so I guess something like that is extremely unlikely. I don't even know how you assess the severity. But Chloe, you said you haven't had to deal with biological hazards, but you must have cleaned mould off things.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, I have. I suppose, yeah. See, we get down to the familiarity again, though. I'm more used to mould, so I don't find it so scary. And I find that, I'm more used to the idea of, you use extraction or a vacuum. And if you need to, you wear a Tyvek suit and then you're fine, But in terms of microbes and things that could transfer, viruses or bacteria or something like that, that's so unknown, and that's difficult to see as well. And I think it's also something that when we talk about collections hazards, it's not one that immediately springs to mind, because particularly in certain museums, we're used to thinking about radioactivity or asbestos or, mercury. There's or pesticides indeed. There's a sort of set number, and I'd say things like biological hazards and sort of compressed air. They're common, but they're not so well known. I'm also completely unfamiliar with firearms and explosives and things like that.
That's an interesting one, because I am in that position.
Are you, Jenny?
without mentioning any names. Yes, I now look after a regimental collection as well as social history, archaeology, and all the other stuff. So that was a bit of an interesting one to come into. Actually, I recently went on a conference which was organised by the Collections Care Group in Icon. Anyway, it was a lovely day at Leeds Armouries, and it was called Bite the Bullet. Basically, it was all about what on earth do you do when you have weapons in your collection. It was a brilliant day. We'll see if they ever repeat it, but it was really good. So if you know anyone who went, ask to steal their notes or something, because it was really useful. It did have really good attendance. Probably at least 60 people there. It was a really nice day. And in fact, I interviewed 2 people from that who were speakers on that day and who are conservators.
Should we listen to that?
Yeah. I'm here with what I would like to call 2 experts, 2 conservators from the Royal Armouries. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yes, of course. My name is Lauren McGhee, and I'm Ellie Rowley-Conwy.
So I was going to start with what's your conservation background like, and how did you come to work at a place like the Armouries?
Well, I guess I'll go first. So I started off getting a job with the National Trust as a conservation assistant. And I think despite having done an archaeology degree, I wasn't really sure. I didn't really know about conservation until I had that job. So I did the Durham University course in conservation. And that's actually where I met Lauren. So we actually trained together at the same time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we've known each other a long time. But then we went our separate ways for our placements. I got to go to Colonial Williamsburg. And I did a tiny bit of armour there, but a really small amount. And then when I came back, I had a very short internship at the Wallace collection. And that was the first time I think I must have worked on a firearm. And then I happened to know a couple of people who worked here, and basically they needed someone to do a 3-month contract at really short notice, and I was out of work at the time, so I jumped at the chance. And then it's been about 4.5 years later, and I'm actually still here. So
well,
basically that's how I came to the Armouries, and I've just never left. And I did an archaeology degree as well, and then ended up becoming interested in conservation when I was volunteering at the Bowes Museum. And then my first job out of Durham University was, as you probably know, Jenny, working at Rotherham.
Yeah.
Based at Clifton Park Museum. And so I was there for 2 years, and then a post came up at the Armouries. So I started September 2014, and I've been here since as well. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. So how long have you both been working with particularly firearms, like in terms of conserving and working with them?
I suppose technically for me it would be about 5 years, because obviously we did have, the firearms at Rotherham, but I would say I've been far more comfortable with working with them since I've been at the Armouries, and perhaps doing more interventive treatments in that time. I think I'm probably similar. It's been about 5 years as well. So as I said before, the first time I really worked on a firearm was at the Wallace collection. But again, I didn't go that far into the sort of dismantling of it. I only did a little bit of that. And it's since I've been here that I've really learned and sort of become more familiar and more comfortable with actually dismantling them for treatments and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it must help that you guys must have a pool of knowledge to kind of draw upon as a part of your bigger team. So you feel,
Absolutely.
presumably feel a bit more comfortable. You have someone to ask.
Definitely. We have 3 firearms curators here, as well as a technical firearms manager. So, and they're very approachable in terms of not just technical information, but the history of something, whether a coating might be original or a later edition, because they would know about the manufacture of that piece. So it's really helpful.
Yeah, we have a really good library here as well, and the curators have built up a really good sort of resource of different manuals for various different firearms as well. So we can look up first the manufacturer's sort of guidelines about how to dismantle them. So that's really helpful as well.
Yes, that's amazing. I have such knowledge envy right now.
It's funny though, because we come across something new and we still have that moment of going, oh no, what do we do with this one?
So could you tell me about the range of firearms that you deal with as part of your jobs?
Pretty much everything, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So the Royal Armouries as an institution covers 3 sites. The site here in Leeds, we've got the White Tower at the Tower of London, and then Fort Nelson in Portsmouth. And between the 3, we have everything from historical firearms, the earliest types,
hand
through
cannons,
right through to the most modern pieces. Down at Fort Nelson, Matt Hancock, our conservator there, is a specialist in artillery. So he does the kind of big guns, as it were, and we work on pretty much everything else. Yeah.
So we have all sorts of historic, and we're still acquiring things now. We actually, as part of the Royal Armouries, we have the MOD pattern room collection, which makes the National Firearms Centre, which is kind of a collection within our collection. So every time they had a new weapon that they came up with, even the experimental ones as well, they'd send the pattern out to the factories to be made, and they've always kept one of those patterns back. So we've got all of the sort of MOD, everything they've ever made. We have a copy of that, which is really nice. And we still, and as I said, we still acquire stuff now. So we have a lot of very modern stuff as well. We do have a working collection as well, and our technical firearms manager works on that. So he's very good with the more modern stuff. So he's a really great resource as well. If we're working on similar objects that aren't in the working collection, they're actually still the museum pieces as well.
And because we also acquire things increasingly from film and television, we have some quite quirky pieces like the pulse rifle from Aliens. So
that's the kind of stuff that you don't really think about being collected, but that's amazing.
It's that's sort of a newer project that we have, isn't it, called Collecting Cultures, and that's thrown up some kind of weird and wonderful things, hasn't it, really?
Yes.
And been quite interesting.
That's amazing. I love that. That's an exhibition in and of itself, isn't it?
I think so,
exactly.
So I think when conservators are confronted with having weapons in their collection, especially firearms, I think the major fear is it live? Is it going to go off? But I mean, aside from a firearm going off, what would you say the major hazards are when working with a firearms collection?
Most, because they're dynamic objects, most of them do have parts under pressure, even if it's not directly linked to the firing mechanism. So you do have to be careful where you put your hands. Some of them are very heavy.
Yes, yeah. And sometimes if you're moving the mechanism, so for example, like if you accidentally dry fired the weapon, if it's a historic flintlock, if you had your hand in the way of where the flint actually comes down, that could get quite a nasty and quite painful.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah, weight is another thing. Some of them are really heavy, and also they can be quite unbalanced as well. So you have to be careful sort of how you pick them up, even, not just how heavy they are as well.
And then I would say firearms are quite a common source, if that's the right word, for other types of hazards. We find asbestos in a lot of our machine guns and submachine guns because of it was used for its heat resistant properties mostly. And also radioactive sources like you find radium paint on gun sites, for example. So just quite a lot to be aware of, actually.
I know. It sounds frightening, but
it's really okay.
It's fine, really.
So speaking of that, where's a good place to go for advice and recommendations if you are kind of alone with a firearms collection? Where can you go to seek some support?
Well, I mean, obviously the Royal Armouries.
Yes.
We like to think that we can give good advice, and we're always happy to help out. So specifically for conservation advice, obviously we're always available and happy to answer people's queries. But also, I mean, there's other places that have big firearm collections that they're used to dealing with. You know, just a couple of examples. Imperial War Museum, I'm sure they can give you a lot of advice as well. And the Wallace Collection as well, for the more historic firearms. They've got quite a few.
National Army Museum.
Yeah, so there's lots of big firearms collections out there where you can sort of go to people for advice if you just don't know where to start and things.
And then at the museum here, I mean, aside from us, there are our curators who could give advice, our registrars who are great on the legalities and kind of moving and packing, transport. And then we also have technicians here who are used to making custom mounts and storage solutions. We're always happy to help.
Yeah, and of course, you know, you'll always have in your region, you'll have a local firearms liaison officer. So always go to them for legal issues as well. And I'm sure they can link you up to people who know a bit more about firearms as well.
That's fantastic. So how would you go about contacting that liaison person? Like, where do you go to look for that person?
I suppose you'd have to go through the police. Our registrar deals with all of that, so I can't say that we know for sure ourselves. But they are part of the police force, aren't they?
Yes,
so I would contact your local police station and say who should I get in contact with about that. And they're usually quite interested in what we're doing, actually, because it's different from what else they're looking at.
And they might come across considerably older firearms than they perhaps normally see.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. What's one piece of advice that you'd like to give to conservators who aren't necessarily very familiar with firearms, but do have them in their collection?
I mean, I think we'd like to say don't be frightened of them. Obviously, you know, take them seriously, but don't sort of be bullied by someone who thinks they know more about firearms than you, because although it is a firearm, at the end of the day, it's a museum object, and that's how you should be dealing with it.
And it's a composite object, so you can look at the materials that it's made from, and as a conservator, you'll be familiar with those and just think, well, I'll treat this as I would something else made of those materials, but taking into account the ethical dimension and, you know, those moving parts that we mentioned.
But don't be frightened. They're not all that scary.
No.
That's a really good piece of advice and really nice to hear as well.
So we still get faced with firearms that we kind of might be vaguely familiar or similar to one that we've done before, but they're all so individual as well that you can't ever be that familiar with all of them. So you just kind of have to go into it knowing that there might be some surprises, but it'll all be okay in the end.
And don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's really good. Do you have any recommendations for any kind of training that might be provided for conservators dealing with this sort of thing?
I'm not sure, really. I mean, I think we'd like to roll out a bit more training, probably. And I know, you know, our registrar's department would quite like to do a bit more, wouldn't they?
Yes. I think moving forward, because we have a newly formed collection services department, it probably will be something that we will be offering here. But icon-linked events are always worth keeping an eye out for as well.
Yeah. It doesn't seem to be that much specifically looking at firearms at the moment. So I think that is an area that's lacking, which, well, hopefully we can, moving forward, we can try and sort that out, really. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, that will be a good one. Keep us up to date.
Of course.
Thank you both so much for joining us today.
That's okay. It's been fun.
Thank you.
So I hadn't, obviously, because I have no experience in firearms, I was interested. I thought, well, explosives are dangerous. You don't want them to, don't want to set fire to them. But I hadn't thought it as far as the mechanism being dangerous in itself and parts under pressure and that sort of element of it, because that's a much more, this could chop your fingers off type hazard that I hadn't thought about.
Yeah, it is interesting because things that I'd thought of, because I have now handled some weapons, is, wow, they are heavier than they look. And what happens if this goes off? or indeed, is this a live weapon? How do I tell?
How do you tell?
Well, if it's been deactivated, it will have a special mark on it, depending on where it was done. So it will have a special mark on it somewhere. You can look that up, but deactivated weapons will always be marked. If it does not have a deactivation mark, you are holding a live weapon, or at least you're very likely to be holding a live weapon. So that's something to be aware of, which I wasn't previously. So at least that helps. It gives me a clue what to look out for, which is good.
I found it quite reassuring that there is information out there and there is help, and even things like talking to the police, which I hadn't thought about as an option.
No, indeed. I didn't know that these firearm liaison officers existed until that point. So it makes me extremely happy that there's someone I can approach with questions, because of course there are, legal repercussions of how you store your firearms, what you do with them, that sort of thing, because it's a firearm.
I think it's worth saying that all of the hazards that you might consider, obviously I think we can cover all of them here, because that would essentially just be a slightly tedious, terrifying list of all the ways you can die as a conservator. But there is a lot of information out there at the moment in terms of hazard awareness and hazard mitigation and things. Contacting the Science Museum Group, their collections care department, they are of course well up on knowing how to deal with collections hazards, because they approach all of them. And there are other institutions as well, people who manage them. Even if you just Google collections hazards or a particular type of hazard, you will find information sheets from recognised bodies that you can rely on, and then they will have bibliographies and stuff. So there is information out there. And I just want to say that in relation to contacting the police, I feel like there's a sort of ethical. Is there an ethical issue tied up in all of this as well? That obviously you can get a firearm deactivated, and that the communicating with the police is essentially just so that they can help you and you're being all above board. But you also have to, or it's also advised to contact the police if you find controlled drugs in your collection. And again, this isn't something that I considered before working with the science collection. And then we, in one part of my previous life, we have found controlled drugs in an object or in relation to an object. So that is either past medicines or part of certain first aid kits and things like that. Basically, any pills could potentially be a controlled drug. And then as far as I know, the approach to that is hand it to the police and then they will dispose of it, because it's obviously dangerous to have these things in the collections because of theft and all sorts of legal reasons and ramifications, etc., etc.
You can't just take bits of your collection out and give them to the police
this is
for
what
disposal.
I'm saying,
without
So
Not
there's
quite.
an interesting.
It does have a lot of paperwork.
Yeah, there's an interesting, and I don't know how this is approached by documentation and registrars and that level of it. But if your accessioned object is a packet of pills, what happens to that object? I imagine you have to categorise it as disposed of. In particular, I suppose also objects that are made of asbestos, here's this fire blanket. Oh, it looks a bit white and fluffy. There's essentially no way. You can't make a pack of controlled drugs safer, and you can't make an asbestos fire blanket safer. So the approach is essentially you have to dispose of it. And then there's a sort of ethical... I don't know how much we've sort of had the freedom to discuss the ethical guidelines around that, because it's essentially a matter of life and death. It's safety.
Well, this is actually also a thing that comes up with firearms, because if you deactivate a firearm, you are essentially destroying a part of the object. So what you're doing is you're not just removing a tiny part. It tends to be a bit more involved than that. So what you're doing is you're significantly altering the object, and it is no longer a firearm once it's been deactivated. So is that ethical? Now, so this is something that different for example, military collections in the UK handle differently. So some of them will deactivate as a matter of course, because they want to reduce that risk. And in other museums, they are kept as firearms, but they will do other things to mitigate the risk. So things like having extra secure cases and more security and that sort of thing. Much like with any other hazard, it's not always the right option to say deactivate a firearm, because then you are fundamentally changing it. So there's an ethical discussion to have again about what the purpose of the object is, etc.
I would be interested to hear of the non-destruction methods of dealing with high-level asbestos or high-level control drug or other content in objects that would allow people in museums to not throw stuff away, essentially.
Well, for asbestos, for example, is usually sealing it in some capacity.
But in that way, if it's sealed in, you can't look at it, you can't open it or use it for research. Then what's the purpose of it? And I suppose maybe there's some room for a development there of, I suppose, sealed in displays cases.
There's definitely room for a safer way of retaining these objects. Otherwise, you end up with whole classes of objects completely missing from our collections.
This is my concern, yeah.
For example, gas masks, which frequently contain asbestos. Most of the time, I feel like people definitely panic and get rid of them, which can be a valid thing. But at the same time, we can't get rid of every single gas mask ever, because then we have no gas masks.
They can be dealt with very easily, though.
Oh, yes.
They can
I
really
know.
easily get Cadec to look at them. They'll sort it out for you. It does cost, and there we get into another issue of what do you do if you're a museum with no funds at all, and you open a door to a huge asbestos collection or a huge whatever collection, and the appropriate behaviour is to pay someone to handle it for you, and you can't. I imagine, are there funding bodies to approach for that? Is this something that people could get funding for?
I don't know. I've never seen anything out there that deals specifically with that sort of thing. Again, conservation grants in and of themselves can be kind of thin on the ground.
So chemicals, I think, is something that we are so used to. I think we're in too deep as conservators quite a lot of the time. We forget that actually we're in contact with hazards all the time, even if we're in the most safe museum collection that you can think of.
Yeah, that's true. We do use an awful lot of stuff, and having to do the kind of COSHH sheets for every single chemical that I use, it's a refreshingly terrifying practice to just remind yourself that, yeah, actually, these things aren't very nice, so I should be in the fume cupboard, or I should take a bit of extra care. Because it's an interesting one, when you get used to something, it's easy to relax the rules for yourself and forget. Or maybe you just accept the risk and go, oh, it's fine, I'm just going to work 10 minutes with this acetone and the object is too big to go in the fume cupboard. Be fine.
So I think we're particularly bad at assessing the risks of things that we use every day, and also things that other people also use every day. There's a certain kind of culture of saying, well, everyone uses this, it must be okay. And that's not always the case.
Yeah.
So I spoke to Kerith Koss Schrager, who's a conservator that I got into. Well, she contacted me a few months ago because she was doing some research into the safety of cyclododecane, which is something that I was particularly interested in as well. And she spoke to me about her research into hazards and the kind of culture of hazard assessment that there is in conservation, how conservators find out about risks, chemical risks and hazards and things, and how they get their information, that sort of thing. She's the co-chair of the AIC, American Institute for Conservation Health and Safety Committee. And so we talked a bit about that. So have a listen.
My name is Kerith Koss Schrager, and I'm an objects conservator in private practice in New York City. I'm a former chair of the AIC Health and Safety Committee, and my interest in health and safety comes from the fact that before I was a conservator, I was actually on my way to get a doctorate degree in public health. And so once I started getting into internships in conservation, I decided I wanted to go to conservation school instead. But I really saw a huge difference in how people deal with health and safety in museums than what I experienced when I was working in labs in hospitals.
So the thing I wanted to talk to you about was your presentation at the AIC annual meeting this year.
So we used cyclododecane as an example to sort of look at how conservators find and interpret health and safety information. In some ways, it represents every chemical we use in that, there really isn't any exposure data for how conservators use chemicals, including, acetone, methanol. Like, we use them in really strange and unusual ways. Mm-hmm. And then in other ways, it was totally unique because when you talk to people about cyclododecane, they get really excited. They consider it something sort of, mystifying and wonderful. And we were really interested in it because we were seeing workshops and presentations where people were just, they were spraying it all over everything, and they were just letting it sublime into storage areas and public spaces. And there didn't really seem to be a concern with health and safety. Whereas if you said you were going to spray any other chemical all over an object and just let it evaporate and sublime, I think people would have a concern about that. So we really wanted to look into it and understand not just how people dealt with cyclododecane, but how they dealt with just chemicals in general, and how, if they did find health and safety information, how that affected their treatment decisions and working conditions.
So what conclusions did you come to?
So you had written a great paper, in
Thank you.
2008, which was almost 10 years ago now. And we did a lot of research, and really there was nothing new since you had done your paper, which is not surprising because it's considered an industrial chemical. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at it across a broad view of workers in, around the world, there aren't a lot of people. Like, conservation doesn't show up on the radar of industry. So there's absolutely no health and safety information on how conservators use it. For conservators, because we're applying it and then letting it sublime, the primary thing is breathing it in. And for cyclododecane, there's no toxicological information on breathing it in, because that's not how people would be exposed to it in the way that it's supposed to be used, which is an intermediate chemical in another process. So we did all this research, and the grand conclusion we came to is there's no way to know whether it's good or bad. We can't say it's good. We can't say it's bad. There's just no way. But what we found in also doing this research was a couple other interesting things. So we did a survey of the AIC membership, and we got about 240 responses, which isn't huge, but it's actually pretty impressive for a health and safety survey, to be honest. And we totally understand the limitations of these kinds of self-surveys. Like, you're asking people to voluntarily participate, and people will generally, when it comes to health and safety, make themselves sound better than they actually do. So we specifically ask people to be very honest about, like, not what you think you should do, but what you actually do. We wanted to ask people if they felt that they had good access to health and safety information. And surprisingly, it was a higher number than I thought it would be. Like, about 75% said that they thought that they had good access to health and safety information, which still leaves 1 in 4 people feeling like they don't, which is not good either. But then we wanted to figure out if that was really true. Like, were people really having the access to health and safety information that they thought that they were? And the way that we tried to figure that out was we asked them if they knew about the globally harmonized system for hazard communication. Employers were supposed to tell and train their employees on this new system by the end of 2016, I think. So really, conservators should know this stuff, especially if they're working in an institution. So when we asked people if they knew about this globally harmonized system of hazard communication, 55% said that they did, which was a huge difference between the 75% of people who said that they had good access to health and safety information. And so, we thought maybe a good number of those were private practice people who probably really don't have a good way of finding out about this information. But that's a concern, that even if people are using health and safety professionals, maybe they're not getting the kind of information that they need to know. We see that as a common problem. Even with the health and safety professionals that we work with on the Health and Safety Committee, they don't know what conservators are doing. Like, they don't understand how we use these materials in strange ways. So the Health and Safety Committee has created this partnership with the American Industrial Hygiene Association. Part of this relationship is educating the health and safety professionals on what we do in museums, what we do with collections, And then also educating conservators on how to talk to these people about what they're doing. The Health and Safety Committee likes to see ourselves as an interpreter between the two groups, because a lot of times you'll hear health and safety professionals saying, you have to do this, you have to do this, and it's not practical for conservation. One of the projects that I'm working on now is creating a guide for portable fume extractors. Yeah. And these are things that conservators, particularly in private practice, really rely heavily on. And if you talk to health and safety professionals, they really don't like them. Like, they really discourage people from using them. But conservators are going to use them. It's the only choice that they have if you're working in your home or you're working in a studio with no windows. So can we come up with a way to responsibly teach conservators how to use these in a way that the health and safety professionals will find acceptable?
So just out of interest, why don't they like portable fume extractors?
So unless you're really, really conscious of changing out the filters, you could be exposed for a long time. The only way that you would know that it's not actually working is you start to smell your chemical. So at that point, you could have had a significant exposure, because there's no way to measure whether or not your filter is done. And these machines generally just recirculate air into the room. So you've potentially recirculated a lot of contaminated air before you knew you were even being exposed. So if you can, for example, vent them out a window, or set up a ventilation that takes the exhaust and vents it to another space, then you're much better off. But you really have to be really diligent about monitoring how often you use them and keeping track of when you change out your filters.
I think that's a great example, actually, of the kind of practical compromises that conservators have to make, because it's all very well saying, well, these aren't particularly great and they may not necessarily protect you. You may not know if you're being exposed. But as you said, conservators don't often have other options.
Right. And it's also making informed decisions, right? So if you are aware of the risks, then you can decide if that's the risk you want to take. When we asked people whether or not a material was hazardous, affected their treatment decisions, most people said that they, about 60% said that they take the health and safety into consideration, but if it's the best treatment for their object, then they're going to. So, at most things, if you take proper precautions, you can virtually eliminate the risk, right? So if you can work in a hood, if you can wear a respirator, if you wear gloves, these kind of things, you can reduce or eliminate your risk. I think people maybe don't know that not all gloves are the same. And so, nitrile gloves, which we find everywhere in conservation labs, have almost no protection against acetone. They're great for if you're using acetone on a swab, and you're not really touching it, but as soon as you get the acetone in contact with that nitrile glove, it has very little protection for you.
So one of the things you talked about in your AIC talk was this health and safety culture. And you, I think, identified some ways in which conservation was quite specific in that sense, quite weird.
Yeah, so part of our survey was we asked people whether or not they thought back to cyclododecane, whether or not they thought cyclododecane was safe. And what was surprising was 48% said that they thought it was not safe. And then 18% or so said that they thought it was safe. And then the rest didn't have an opinion. Or couldn't come to a conclusion. And so that was really surprising to us, because when we did our literature review, almost every paper said that it was safe. So, yeah, which was surprising for us to come back and have people say, no, we actually do think it's hazardous when we asked them the question.
Yeah.
So we asked people why they thought it was safe or not safe. And so we saw that a majority in both cases came to that conclusion because they saw other people using it, or they read about other people using it. And it was a much lower percent, less than 20%, that actually came to that conclusion from reading the safety data sheet. So people are following learned behavior, which isn't unusual for conservation. I think that happens everywhere, and every health and safety culture, that's probably an issue. What was really kind of dramatic for us was that people were overemphasizing their concern for the object and not at all discussing their concern for their own health and safety. When I did interviews, a lot of people would say things like, well, the smell's not that bad, so I don't really worry about it. And smell is really not a good indicator of And so they'd just be like, well, I aired out the room. But if I was working with somebody else, like I would have been much more careful. Like I would have worn a respirator. And so you see a lot of people being like, well, I don't do this for myself, but if I have a subordinate, then I make them do it. And so there's a recognition that there's a hazard. And a lot of people would say, well, it's too late for me. Like I'm too old and I'm about to retire, but like you're young, you should do it.
So peer pressure is potentially one of the things that encourages compliance with health and safety.
Right. And so creating a culture where people feel comfortable about talking about health and safety. And I think sort of setting up from the top down, a good health and safety culture is really important.
So I'm fascinated by this because kind of by definition, conservators tend to be quite diligent and obviously not necessarily prone to taking shortcuts. We're used to things being quite kind of onerous and doing it properly and so on. So it seems fascinating to me that on the one hand, you could have this huge care for the object and the object's well-being, and at the same time have so little regard for your own health.
Yeah, and I think what's happening is if you don't know that it's an issue, then you don't even know to think about it. So if you're not learning it from the beginning, then it's not something that you realize is missing. So I think people understand inherently that chemicals have hazards, but I don't think you necessarily recognize that maybe the materials that you're using or the objects themselves could be potentially dangerous to you as well, or that your work practices could be dangerous. There's lots of conservators that climb up on ladders, and it's not just chemical hazards. It's one of the other things that I wanted to talk about that we found about in doing our research. And it was something that was a revelation to me as I was doing this research, was that I really didn't understand what a safety data sheet was. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't understand the limitations and what it was actually telling me until I started really looking at different safety data sheets and understanding where they come from and what they do. And that's not something you ever learn. People just say, look at the safety data sheet, and it will tell you if it's safe or not safe, which is absolutely not safe. And I think there's a misinterpretation by people that if there's no data, that means it's safe, right? Yeah. So if it's not saying that it's not safe, then it's safe, which is absolutely not true. It means that no one's ever done a study on it, so they can't say either way. My impression of safety data sheets before I started looking into them was that there was some kind of general repositories where if the manufacturer was selling acetone, they sort of plucked it from there and then, printed it out. And sort of, which is not what happens. And, each manufacturer comes up with their own safety data sheet. So you could have the same chemical from different manufacturers having different information on it. What's interesting is if you look at the safety data sheet for B72, it says that it's a reproductive hazard. But I think you have to look at why it's saying it's a reproductive hazard. So if you look, the 100% resin contains less than 1% of toluene in it. And that's why it's saying it's a reproductive hazard, because it's giving you the safety information for toluene. Right? Yes. If you look at the breakdown for it says acrylic resin, not hazardous, and then it says toluene, and if you look further into the safety data sheet, it's giving you all the horrible things that are associated with toluene, like we all know. But is that 1% of toluene in the amount that B72 is used by conservators and the way that B72 is used by conservators, is that actually a concern? Like, should we really be concerned about that? And then, is it more or less of a hazard than the solvent that you're using to, if you look at something like naphthalene, it's what's found in mothballs. So people used to put naphthalene all over things. Now we know that there's some serious health risks associated with it. And there's also serious sort of long-term effects on objects that have been treated with it or been exposed to it. So I think part of the solution is again, getting people to recognize that there are unknown health and safety risks associated with these materials that we're using early on, and treating them early on as being hazardous so that they don't over time just generally get accepted as safe without any understanding that they're really safe. Like what happened, like no one looks at the safety data sheet for B72 anymore. You just use it.
Yeah.
And so if you start out sort of assuming that something is hazardous instead of automatically assuming that something is safe, then I think that helps things a lot. So if we approach our own health and safety the way that we approach treatment of our objects, like we don't use something on an object until we've tested it and made sure that it's okay. So we should be doing the same thing for ourselves, sort of assuming that something is not safe until we can prove otherwise. Another reason I think people are sort of a little bit more blasé about health and safety and conservation is there's not many people that you can say got sick from working, right? So I can't say that I know anyone who died from being a conservator. You can say lots of people die from being construction workers, and lots of people die from working in factories that use mercury all the time. So, there are lots of people who worked with asbestos, So I think when you don't see that there are health effects happening, then you don't really have the urgency to take the precautions that you need to be taking.
Sure. I mean, I there are many hundreds or thousands of times as many people working in construction as there are in conservation. And also we don't have a formal way of recording the long-term health effects.
Yeah, so that's another thing we were trying to look at is there a way that we can see, are there higher levels of incidence of cancer among conservators? But that kind of study is so in-depth and so difficult that, it's something that AIC would really have to invest in, or have a group that would be really willing to invest in it with us. And that was one of the survey questions that we asked, if people would be interested in those kinds of studies, whether or not there's increased health effects among conservators as a group, and whether or not, certain exposure studies for certain chemicals. And overwhelmingly, almost every single person was like, yes, we need that.
I'm just wondering how you get information through to conservators working in private practice who don't often have the luxury of taking unpaid time off to go on courses and so on.
So the Health and Safety Committee is pretty active. We have our AIC newsletter that gets published 5 times a year, and we always try and have a substance article in there that's really sort of on a conservation, health and safety topic. And then we do periodical things, so I'm doing the fume extractor guide, which will be separate. And then we try and do sort of these e-blasts to because a lot of times we'll be like, wouldn't it be great if you guys did an article on reproductive health and conservation? And we're like, we did it already.
Yeah, okay.
Wouldn't it be great if you had a chart that told you which gloves you could use? And we're like, here it is. We did it already. So the issue is we can't, we can give you all this information, we can't make you read it, right? So there's only so much we can do to get information out to people. My co-chair and I were both in private practice, so, we were really aware of the kind of issues that people have in private practice, particularly if you're working in your home and your kids are around.
Sure. What's next with your research? Are you going to publish this? Are you going to sort of follow it up with more research?
Well, so our PowerPoint presentation will be available online. So that'll be available, I think, in September. I'm hoping to sort of publish a more in-depth look at our results from our survey, as sort of going through it and seeing what was statistically significant, and sort of coming some bigger conclusions because it was a 20 question survey, so there was a lot of stuff to sort of put together. The one thing that I really would like to see is I do want to see something on safety data sheets, something that really lets people know how to read safety data sheets, what their limitations are, how you should interpret them as a conservator. So I think that's one of the projects that's sort of up on the agenda to be done. And then we also, with this collaboration and partnership with the American Industrial Hygiene Association, we're really looking into a lot of different programs to get sort of formal health and safety training for conservators, and what kind of resources can health and safety professionals, because they have a lot more teaching tools than AIC does for this particular type of stuff. So if we can use their resources to help our membership, that's really great.
Well, Kerith Koss Schrager, thank you very much for talking to the C Word today.
Thank you. It was great having me. Thank you.
Right, so I feel like it's particularly poignant that she kind of brings up the same thing, that there's this attitude amongst conservators that maybe it's all right if I don't wear a mask. But if there's someone else in the room with me, or if I'm supervising someone, then we all better wear masks. I kind of love that because I recognize myself in it, and that I will be slightly stricter if there's someone else with me. Which is weird. It's my health, for goodness sake. Why am I not more cautious?
I think I've found not the opposite, but a different attitude of almost, people who are, again, more familiar with the risk. They're less bothered, essentially, and they won't wear a mask. They've said, of course, you wear a mask if you feel like it, but then a sort of not as we've just heard in the interview, a sort of, well, I can't be bothered, but you should be worried about your health because you're young. I'm too far gone now. I'm old.
Although I find it interesting because I feel like we've both probably experienced this, that we've flagged up a risk and gone, can we wear a mask for this task? And people who seem to be our age still seem to go, well, I wouldn't really wear one, but fine, I guess you can, which is a more rare attitude. But I would...
Yeah, it's really hard because it's kind of an implicit criticism of the other person.
Yeah, which
that they're not taking it seriously enough.
Like, I guess, yeah, exactly. But it's never meant like that. Like, for me, for example, maybe I know that I have an underlying condition. For example, if I was asthmatic, I would probably be very keen to wear some sort of respirator for whenever I was near chemicals or fumes of any kind. So it might just be that I'm approaching it from I've risk assessed this for myself because, and I think I need this because of an underlying reason that I'm not going to tell you because it's none of your business,
Yeah, and in the same way, when I'm dealing with chemicals, I have an extremely strong sense of smell, and I can find working with some chemicals quite overwhelming. So I will wear a mask because I'm, aware that I don't want to make myself more sensitive to certain things, or I just essentially just don't want to feel sick for 2 hours. So I will maybe go at OTT in some people's eyes in terms of respiratory PPE, and that's never a comment on somebody else's behaviour or what I think something will happen to somebody else. But I think that there can be a bit of a sort of a perception of accusatory, a perception of
accusation. I think
accusation. Yeah, perception of accusation that another person who is not observing various PPE opportunities is being flippant or unsafe or whatever. Because essentially, yes, we have rules, and for certain cases, the rules will need to be observed, but it is everyone's personal choice.
Yeah, so basically, people can want to use PPE for all sorts of strange reasons that you might not know about. So nobody should take it as a criticism. It's ultimately about ourselves and what we're comfortable with.
So it's interesting. I was going to say, I think it's interesting though that it's that way around, that we feel we have to justify wanting to wear it rather than people feeling they have to justify opting out of it.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways we are quite cavalier about these things. One of the things Kerith was looking at was how there's often a presumption that if there's no information about a chemical, that therefore it's safe. In a kind of, well, surely they would tell us if it was dangerous. But actually sometimes it's just that there's thousands, she says roughly 100,000 commercial chemicals. They haven't looked at all of them.
No.
And they certainly haven't looked at all of them in all particular contexts, and the way that we use things in conservation often means that we're exposed to risks that just aren't there for other people. She sent me her presentation. I particularly love the line that she says several circumstances make conservators unique health and safety cases. The first is that we know that conservators use weird stuff to do weird things, and I think that perfectly sums it up. That often we're using these things in ways that nobody would think they would be used, and so nobody's even thought to see if this is actually an inhalation risk or whatever, which is why we were talking about cyclododecane.
Yeah, exactly. And also, if you do look at material safety data sheets, which she did bring up, can be very different for different manufacturers. Quite often, if you do properly really read them, it'll say no information or no research found in a lot of these cases. So it's just a case of, well, we don't know, so we haven't said anything about it, which is probably not.
It's not safe.
Yeah, that's not what we take away from it. We go, oh, that's fine then. Not there could still be a risk. Which it's very blue sky thinking of conservators to go, well, there's no information, so everything's fine.
I suppose it's, in a sense, quite rare for conservators. We tend to be thinking about all of the things that could possibly be going wrong at each time, and actually, but when it comes to our personal health, we're like, but it's probably fine, isn't it?
Yeah, quite.
We'll be fine.
And I did also love that she did say that it would be good if bodies like the AIC could do health and safety research or commission a piece where...
I think that's incredibly important.
It really is.
Really,
and
really
I would personally love if our professional body, so ICON, would also do that, because that is a massive piece of research that is actually profoundly important if you think about it.
Well, it's interesting that AIC has a health and safety specialty group, interest group, and ICON doesn't.
No, that's true. Which is a good point.
So there's a bit of a gap there, and I think we should be filling it. And it I suppose arguably some of this stuff is dealt with by the other interest groups and possibly by Kerith Collections as well. But I think it goes beyond that. It would be really good to have that as a particular area of focus.
Definitely agreed.
Particularly because the other issue is that of kind of getting reliable information, not just word of mouth from other conservators and not just I've seen people doing this, but actually having someone who's responsible for looking at how conservators use particular chemical hazards in particular contexts and then assessing what actually are the risks from those and what is the reliable information we can get, not just I think it's safe or, but how likely are you to be at risk from using white spirit to clean a painting in a confined room for 6 hours a day, for example. So I think that's the kind of thing that can only really be done by a professional body. Actually.
Yeah, the funding needs to be available. And I think it'd be interesting also to just open up the conversation broader to large institutions that have the power and the audience to access data. So I found particularly interesting the idea of, well, maybe is there a higher rate of cancer in conservation? It's not something that we're, any smaller project is going to be able to find out. It has to be a sort of overarching body that can identify potential results of the hazards that we're faced with, because otherwise we can say, well, we know that there is this amount of research, as you said, for other industries of this rate of certain illnesses, but we don't know at all on how we're using certain chemicals, what effect that has.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that really should be tackled. And I think it's something that should be tackled quite soon, because it's going to be a long-term study, and if we're going to have any use of it, it kind of needs to happen.
It's worth saying, I think we've probably got better. I think science in general and science knowledge, hazard knowledge has got, and workplace exposure limits has got, all of this has got a lot better. So this isn't a sort of alarmist section of the podcast in any way. We are much better than we were, and we know old conservators, they've not all died age 35,
Yeah, no, quite.
So it's, that's not to say that there's not a risk, but that we are in a much better place than we were. It would just be to be, scientists about it. We need to have data, and we need to be fully aware of the hazards that we are facing so that we can just mitigate them.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, we no longer live in like an information poverty era where it was difficult to get information. If anything, we live in the opposite world now, where information is plentiful. Might not necessarily be exactly what we want, but information is out there if you're willing to look, and there's always the possibility of generating more information.
We'll get together some useful resources about health and safety for conservators, and we'll put them in the show notes.
Brilliant. If you've got any comments, questions, or corrections, as always, we're really happy to hear from you. This time we just wanted to say thank you to everyone who wrote in response to our Raspberry Pi episode with their Arduino projects. Now, the Arduino is a microcontroller motherboard, which sounds scary. So it's similar but different to the Raspberry Pi. Basically, it's a similar piece of technology, but it's simpler. It can do one thing at a time. So repetitive tasks it's very good at for programming. And loads of people have written in with great collections care ideas and projects and research they're doing involving it. And thank you to everyone. We might try to do something special on it in season 3 or something, because it seems like there's an awful lot of you who'd love to talk to us, which is brilliant. So we just want to say thank you for that. As always, we love hearing from you, so please do write in. Patreon shout out! Welcome to our new patrons, Sora, Christine, and Naomi. Welcome, guys. As always, if you'd like to support us on Patreon, you can do so too. If you just go to patreon.com/the C Word. Thanks for listening. We're the C Word, and you've been listening to Christina Rosaic, Chloe Rumsey, and me, Jen Mathiasen. Special thanks to our 3 guests. Join us next time for an episode about education and learning. In the meantime, you can check out our website at thecword.show, tweet us at thecwordpodcast, or simply email us on thecwordpodcast@gmail.com. The intro and outro music is Spring by DD Music, used under Creative Commons Attribution License. Additional music and sound effects by Callum Robertson. This has been a Wooden Dice production.